Hello everyone, my name is Henry Birge-Lee from Princeton University. Today I'm going to be talking about global BGP attacks that evade route monitoring. This work was done with Jennifer Rexford and Maria Postolaki, also at Princeton. So let me begin by motivating the problem. What is BGP monitoring and why is it important? Well, I think of BGP monitoring as using a combination of public and/or private data feeds to observe global BGP updates. And monitoring is really important because it can not only be used for real-time responses to attacks, but it's also a way we have to identify BGP attacks after the fact. And as high security routing measures like BGP-SEC are taking a little bit to get adopted, I think monitoring is really important in the BGP ecosystem because essentially this is our way of finding out what's happening and detecting attacks. So with that in mind, let me give a little bit of background also on stealthy BGP attacks. So why is it interesting that an adversary can have a stealthy attack? Well, if you think about it, if we're relying on monitoring for attack detection and mitigation, if an adversary can make their attack stealthy, they can evade these defenses, and then their attack can sort of go on a lot longer, or maybe the hard resources they had to invest in that attack will not get burned quite as easily. So I think this is a really important problem. And it's also been shown to be possible in sort of a variety of previous works. So at this point, I think it's very important to clarify terminology. So what do I mean by a stealthy BGP attack? And when you dig down into it, there's actually many different metrics by which an attack can be stealthy. So the first one is kind of how much of it sees your route. So you imagine if you were to launch an attack in a small isolated geographic region, maybe people wouldn't make that big a deal. It's like, okay, 5% of connectivity or something is lost, but maybe stuff will go on as long as happy eyeballs. I'm not particularly focusing on that today. The other one, which has been a major focus of my research, and I think the GRIP talks from Georgia Tech will shed light on, is do you have algorithms that can pick out this attack from the noise of benign BGP updates? And you can imagine an attack could be stealthy because you could make it look like all the BGP updates that are happening every day. Super interesting topic, but not what I'm looking at today. The other interesting one is, okay, so you can have attacks where actually the people who are using the malicious route, so networks sending traffic and sending traffic to the adversary, don't actually know that they're using it because that route, the malicious route, is not in their own network table. We also achieve this by this attack, but the primary definition of stealth I am focusing on today is, do BGP monitoring services see the route? So essentially, on the long list of BGP updates that are generated by route views and write briefs, does the adversary's BGP update get added to that list? So we consider it stealthy in this context if it's not on any of the monitor's feeds anywhere. Also, I think this is fairly common nowadays, but in terms of attack terminology, there's sort of two paths an adversary can go. They can either announce the same prefix of the victim that they're attacking. So this data center on the right side is operating out of 222/23. In the equally specific prefix attack scenario, the adversary just announces that same prefix. In the subprefix attack, the adversary announces a longer prefix, presumably one that has some critical resource in the data center on it. And subprefix attacks largely get global preference because it's a longer, more specific match, longest prefix match routing. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to talk about kind of the state of the art for where the community stands on stealthy BGP attacks. I'd say there's largely two camps. Camp one is you can launch an equally specific prefix attack and then do a whole bunch of stuff, including communities, AS path poisoning, and then also just announcing to very few neighbors to avoid all of the public monitors. So there's actually quite a lot of ASs that are providing data to monitoring services, and they can actually all be avoided. So this is possible. My work, as well as previously presented work at RIPE, show that you can do this. The downside is that, as I mentioned, there's actually a lot of monitors out there. So once you've chopped up the internet enough to make this strategy work, you're really only announcing over, say, a couple of peering sessions. It's not like a huge chunk of the internet that uses your route. And then also, like, the people that do use it, it actually gets installed in their route tables. And so, you know, if you're able to get access to those or something's going on in an investigation, you can find it there. The other interesting one, I think came up sort of in more recent literature, is that you can actually just stop the attack from spreading to the people that are using it. So you pretty much have to do this with a subprefix attack. It exploits sort of routing with different prefixes. So say there's a /23 that carries it to a provider who happens to have a /24 and then kind of reroutes it. So the victim doesn't actually know that they are using a malicious route. Super interesting, but in the traditional sort of subprefix context, that prefix will spread through the internet largely uncontested. There's no victim announcement of the same prefix length. And as a result, like, you see this attack at many, many public monitors. So I also want to talk about a real-world stealthy attack, and this is an attack that actually happened some years ago. An adversary established a direct peering with Yahoo Mail at DE6, and it just announced its malicious routes over this direct peering. So no transit, it just sent the malicious routes to Yahoo Mail, and this did successfully evade all BGP monitors. Eventually, believe it or not, this attack was used for spam email sending. Eventually, the true victim owner, after many complaints from Yahoo Mail, got in touch with the Yahoo Mail network operators, and they were able to find out that Yahoo Mail had this route in their table that wasn't being announced by the prefix owner. So they were able to catch that. And also, it's worth noting this is a very hyper-localized attack. Like, Yahoo Mail was the one AS on the internet that was routing traffic incorrectly. For most purposes, this prefix was sort of reachable and still doing okay. All of this together, I think, leads to kind of the current understanding on stealthy attacks, which is that although you can make attacks that are sometimes completely stealthy, these attacks can only affect, you know, at most like 2% of the internet. So this is out of a previous work in IEEE Access, and they were looking kind of at these selective neighbor announcements and poisoning. So I think this is in generally true, but today I would like to present an attack that can affect the vast majority of the internet, is seen by absolutely no BGP monitors, and not even the networks that are going to be sending traffic down this malicious route see it in their route table. So I think it's really important to step back and understand that all of the mechanisms we have and have successfully used to catch these BGP attacks can be evaded by this attack. So now let me go a little bit into actually how do you launch this attack. So the key insight is to have the adversary flag their route with a community known as no export. For those of you who are not aware, communities are 32-bit tags that you can attach to a route. And one of the many things communities can do is determine how downstream routers will go and repropagate your route. The RFC that introduced BGP communities introduced 3 well-known communities. One of them is this no export community. And it essentially says, do not propagate this route outside of your own AS. So the route propagates within the AS, but when it hits an AS boundary, you're supposed to suppress the output. And it's important to understand that this is actually baked into most routers by default. Because it's in the RFC, routers that support communities tend to have the functionality to honor the no export. They know what an eBGP session is, and then they suppress on those links. But write risks and route views, the way they actually get the data that they put into their BGP feeds is with eBGP sessions with major networks. So to the routers at those networks, they think that's an eBGP session. As a result, they go and they apply the no export community, and they don't send the update to write risks and route views. And this, I think, is a large deviation from previous work in that previously, you know, we had always assumed that if a network that was providing data to RIS had a malicious route in their table, that route would be sent to RIS. We would see it in the update feeds. Obviously, if it's heard but not used as best path, that's a different story. But if it's selected as best path on a major network that's sending data to RIS, we should see that in the update feed. But with this technique, we can actually put the routes in those networks and still hide them from RIS. And as I said, this makes us be able to be much more stealthy than or much more effective than the previous work on stealthy attacks. Just to visually demonstrate this, on the left side here, we have sort of the status with prior works that if Cogent 174 selects a path as best path, it's going to send that over its eBGP session to RIPE-RIS. They specifically peer with RRC25, and this is an eBGP session. RIPE-RIS establishes their sessions out of 12654. So it's like another AS to Cogent, but then it gets appended to the RIPE-RIS, update logs. If the adversary tags their route with no export, seen on the right side here, the route can actually enter the Cogent table. Cogent can use it as best path, but will still suppress on this edge to RIPE-RIS. So now you've gotten the route into a major backbone, even a global backbone, but it's not in RIPE-RIS. So what are specifically the steps for launching this attack? First, it starts by the adversary announcing a subprefix of the victim's prefix, and ideally to a major transit provider that's going to be en route for a lot of traffic. Now, I understand that major transit providers tend to have prefix whitelists specifically on their customers. I'm going to talk a bit about that later. I'm not addressing that right here. Let's assume that the adversary somehow bypasses those. Then the adversary attaches the no export community to their announcement. And as I was mentioning, currently monitoring services are run over eBGP sessions, so the default behavior in routers is to suppress at these edges. And then finally, you get this phenomena where a major transit provider has the route installed but has not exported it to anybody. And this is most effective if you target your victims upstream. So if the provider is being used for the victim's traffic and you target that network, then you can get near 100% of the internet using the attack. So I want to take a brief pause to mention that everything I'm about to talk about was done completely ethically. This is largely a hijacking ourselves approach. So this is our own IP space. All the nodes, including the ones I'm using as the adversary, had authorization to announce this. So we did not test the social engineering or sort of filtering mechanisms of any major networks. We had authorization to announce this prefix, and there were no real services on it. We were mostly studying route propagation and whether it would propagate to monitors. So in our benign setup, we announced this IPv6 prefix from a data center in Silicon Valley. The data center had Cogent 174 as an upstream, and then we had a test client in Sao Paulo, but also effectively the attacks were all global, so all over the world was affected. We began with a benign, or control case, not benign, a control subprefix attack. So we just announced the more specific of the adversary's prefix. This was effective in the data plane, so the traffic from Sao Paulo was being routed to the adversary. But then, of course, we looked in the control plane, and this was totally visible. So this is a Birge-6 dump from the Sao Paulo client, and it shows the /48 in the client's table. This is Cisco Crossword Cloud. We had configured it to throw an alert if we saw a subprefix for that /47. And the active there, that means that it did see the subprefix. There was an active alert. And then, obviously, for this venue, we were subscribed to RIPE-RIS. And if you notice peer ASN 174, so this is actually coming directly from Cogent's session with RIPE-RIS. Highlighted in red, you can see the /48. So as we expected, all of our monitoring systems were working correctly. We then tagged the route with the no export community, and we actually did not use the RFC defined version. Cogent has their own specific version, which is 174.990. With the 174.990 community, the route didn't spread beyond Cogent. So none of the monitors, and even the monitor connected with Cogent via direct link, got this announcement. But the data plane traffic from the client in Sao Paulo, we confirmed was being rerouted to the adversary. So going through our monitors again, the client still saw this /47. It looked like its route table had never changed. Crossword Cloud threw no alarms. And then our RIPE-RIS feed was just empty. It looked completely like routing was stable and normal during this attack. So we can confirm actually that this attack successfully hijacked almost 100% of the internet. We did this by selecting a sample of 1,000 ping hosts. We set the source IP of our ping scan to inside the hijacked net block. So when these hosts generated a response, it would either go to the victim or the adversary, depending on how that host's network was routing traffic. In the scan, 100% of responses went to the adversary. So every host we could find was routing traffic to the adversary instead of the victim. And I should mention this was as expected because the prefix owner exclusively used Cogent for transit. So they had one provider, we put the malicious route in that provider. If you're interested in seeing a video demo of this, you can visit it at this link. So we wanted to move beyond just a single isolated case to look at the viability of the attack in the wild. I want to thank our partner networks we worked with, including RGNet, NJ Edge, which is Princeton's provider, and Princeton, the OIT office. And we were able to test these 4 major networks using their support. What we found is that all of the networks honored no export or some specific variant of it. All of them had a monitoring session with write risks. When we attached no export, they all stopped exporting the route over the monitoring session with write risks. We also tested this in Thousand Eyes and Cisco Crossword Cloud, and we also noticed that they were no longer able to see the route once it was no export tagged. You also might be realizing now that while I'm talking about no export, that also limits the spread of the adversary's malicious route because you have to go one network at a time. It's not going to propagate from network to network the way traditional BGP hijacks do. So how much of the internet can you actually get? Well, if we ran simulations of AS paths between 150 random source destination pairs from the CADA topology, and just assuming an adversary installed their malicious route in the 4 networks from the previous slide, they would be able to hijack 23% of those paths. So 23% of them had one of those 4 networks on path. If the adversary instead operated more strategically and chose the top 5 ASs by CADA customer cone size, so essentially how many customers and customers do you have in that AS, looking at the top 5 from that metric, you improve this number to 39%. So as I was mentioning, this is a pretty big difference from the sort of 2% that previous work was looking at. And it's largely enabled because you can now put routes into the large networks that are providing write risk data and not have it noticed. And obviously, if you just go and poison the routes of all of your victims' transit providers, then you get up to near 100% like we did. I think it's also worth noting that this requires a subprefix attack, and one of the best tools we have to prevent subprefixes is RPKI. Essentially, when you write an ROA, you specify how long that prefix can be announced in the global route table, so the maximum permissible length. But there is sadly one flaw that happens a lot with ROA configurations, and I think it's justified by networks wanting flexibility, but a lot of networks, I should mention we're at very good coverage now at 50%, still 50% not protected, so it's quite relevant still, but we have good ROA coverage. What I was trying to get to is that many networks improperly configure the max length, so they want to have more routing flexibility. They configure a max length that's longer than what they really need at the moment. So if you're announcing a /23, but maybe you're going to deaggregate in the future, you might have an ROA that says /23 up to maximum length, /24. But that means an adversary can just sneak in there, announce that /24 uncontested, and launch a subprefix hijack. When you kind of take all of these factors in together, the partial coverage, and then the fact that some people have max length wrong, a previous paper of mine at Usenix Security looked at how many domains actually had all of their IP prefixes somehow protected against subprefix attacks. We came out with something around 30%. Domains have a lot of IPs as well, normally DNS and A record providers. And honestly, it was only about half of these were really protected because of RPKI. The other half would just because they ran everything on /24. So that's kind of the good old school way of stopping subprefix attacks, but obviously not good for route table size. So RPKI progress is really, really great. We need to keep doing that, but I personally think that doesn't, in the short term, do much to change the viability of subprefix attacks, which will remain a threat for the time being. And then also, I know I mentioned prefix filters. Prefix filters are incredibly important. Know your customer is incredibly important. Like all of this is the front lines. It's just that I think we also need backup because yes, sadly, major tier ones will occasionally propagate a malicious route. These are just some nanog list examples, if you will. But this is definitely something that happens. Even the best tier ones with the best sales teams and the best know your customer can potentially be fooled by a creative, determined adversary. So I really think we need to rely on this, but also have cryptographic measures, backups, and good monitoring visibility in addition. So as I mentioned, I would really like to improve this situation, and there are very concrete countermeasures that networks can take. So at a high level, the countermeasures revolve around this idea that a customer should not decide whether or not you send a route to route monitoring. Like I, as an ISP customer, I shouldn't say, okay, I'm giving you this route, but please don't tell RIPE-RIS about it, you know? And there are several options for this. I'd say kind of the most straightforward is at ingress to a router, translate the RFC no export community into something within the local AS community namespace. And then on the normal BGP peers, you now have flexibility to decide how you interpret that community. And for normal peers, you interpret it the same way the RFC specifies. For RIPE-RIS, you send all the routes, even if they have the community tagged. Option 2, which I've had some networks interested in, is just move the sessions to IBGP. IBGP is not affected by these no export communities. This is being used by Kentech, so there's some precedence of industry using this. There's a minor vulnerability still with no advertise, but we've now moved the attack from localized to a single AS to localized to a single router. So that's a much, much smaller attack vector. I'd say the long term, and many people bring this up, is we should move the monitoring to BMP. That would be really great. I think the engineering efforts behind that on both the RIPE-RIS side and the network side still a little down the road, but probably the proper long-term move, because then the routers fundamentally understand the difference between a monitoring session and just another BGP peer. And then also kind of at the middle ground, you could imagine like it'd be nice if there was a flag that you could put on an eBGP session that just says, oh, this is actually a session for monitoring. So it'd be neat if there's a vendor support flag. Obviously, this requires a vendor to put it into their implementation. Just briefly, this is kind of a bird-like configuration for a hypothetical AS1234. I apologize if you own AS1234. But you can imagine stripping these communities at import, replacing them with sort of these AS-specific communities that don't have the same baked-in behavior. And then on BGP neighbors, you match on the AS-specific communities. But for RIPE-RIS, you just have a blanket accept rule. The other one, as I mentioned, is to move the sessions to IBGP. So this is just replacing with IBGP. And in addition to next hop self, there are several things like local pref and metric that you could filter and remove from those routes before you sent them to RIPE-RIS. As I mentioned at the bottom, I think it'd be really great if the RIPE NCC admins considered IBGP sessions. It is being used by Kentech right now. I have interest in deploying these countermeasures at the US RNE networks, particularly ESNet and Internet 2. But I'd really like to extend the invitation more broadly to any network that are interested in mitigating this at your own network. Please, please reach out to me. If you are interested in more details on these attacks and more measurements, this is the technical report we published on archive at the bottom. So I really appreciate your time, and I'd like to end by taking any questions.